This PowerPoint will introduce you to some key details and issues regarding Egypt and Mesopotamia that will allow us to understand the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds of the literature, history, and worldviews represented in the collection of literature called the Old Testament. Along the way, I'll ask you a few times to take a minute and think a little more in depth about some of the ideas and claims we'll be making in this presentation. When that happens, you should pause the video and write down your thoughts so you can refer to them later and so that we can talk about them in class if need be. Let's start by looking at ancient Egypt. In her work, Gloria Fierro notes, quote, "Geography, climate, and the realities of the natural environment worked to shape the worldviews and religious beliefs of all ancient peoples." Take a minute and ask yourself, how does this claim apply to the ancient Egyptians? Look at the map that I've provided for you on this slide. What can you tell about the geography of ancient Egypt? Does it look like to you that Egypt has many neighbors? If not, what might that imply about the relative security of ancient Egypt? Also, what do you know about the Nile River? Is there a sense in which the Nile would provide a sense of regularity and stability for Egyptians? If so, how might this have influenced their literature and worldview? From all available evidence, the religious system in ancient Egypt was polytheistic. What does that mean? Let's break that word down together. The Greek prefix poly means many or several, while the main component of this term stems from the Greek word theos, meaning God. As such, a polytheistic religious system is one in which there's more than one God present. Let me ask you a few questions as a way of prodding you to learn more about the religious beliefs and practices of ancient Egypt. Based on what you know of ancient Egyptian religion, is this a religious system that has a dominant deity? That is there one God who's more powerful than other gods? On a related topic, what sort of religious meanings did the ancient Egyptians attach to their land and to the Nile? How might the answers to these questions help us understand how ancient Egyptians attempted to understand the physical world around them through religious means? One of the most interesting aspects of ancient Egyptian religion was their belief in resurrection. How did they understand resurrection, and who normally got resurrected? Everyone, or only certain people? Also, how did ancient Egyptians go about preparing for resurrection? In trying to answer this question, it's also important for us to ask about the governmental structure present in ancient Egypt. How did this culture understand the identity of its leader, the pharaoh? How did they put this understanding into practice once the pharaoh died? The ancient Egyptian understanding of death is nowhere more evident than in its spectacular architecture. The crowning achievement of this architecture are the pyramids. In this slide, I provide an image of the pyramids at Giza, which were primarily built during the 27th century BCE. From what we can tell, the pyramids served the ancient Egyptians as both elaborate burial mounds and homes for important figures in the afterlife. Take a minute and ask yourself, how are both of these goals accomplished? That is, how and why do the pyramids function as death houses? In trying to understand how the ancient Egyptians dealt with death, it's also important for us to mention a remarkable collection of texts referred to as the Book of the Dead. As you can see, this is a collection of funerary prayers dating from around 4000 BCE, whose purpose was to assist the dead in their journey and prepare them for the Last Judgment. In the detail I provide for you on this slide, you can see a pictorial representation of the Last Judgment. The one who's died is about to be judged by Anubis, the dog-headed figure underneath the scales which serve to weigh the good and bad deeds of the one who has died. If the good deeds outweigh the bad, then the dead's in pretty good shape. If not, they might be subject to destruction by Amet, the great devourer, the friendly-looking figure in the lower right corner of the image. One of the most important aspects of ancient Egyptian religion in terms of its influence on Old Testament literature is the activity of the pharaoh named Amenhotep IV. In the mid-14th century, he changed his name to Akhenaten to reflect his devotion to a deity named Aten, the god of the sun disk. As you can see in the image on the right of the slide, Akhenaten and his family are making offerings specifically to Aten. Since this image dates from the mid-14th century, we're on safe ground assuming that this is an accurate representation of the religious practice of Amenhotep. Scholars have recovered a document from this time titled The Hymn to the Aten, which is a song of praise and adoration that bears a striking resemblance to several of the Psalms in the Old Testament, most specifically Psalm 104. Now, some scholars argue that this is the first instance of monotheism in Western history, but take a minute and ask yourself, is this monotheism or is it henotheism? That is this a religious system in which one and only one God exists? Or is this a religious system in which numerous gods exist, but only one is worshipped? Why might this be an important issue for us to raise in attempting to understand the literature in and theological views of the Old Testament? Another interesting detail regarding Akhenaten is the fact that his queen Nefertiti became a very important figure in Egyptian history in her own right. Continuing our discussion of Akhenaten and his family, on this slide I've provided two images. The top image is another representation of Akhenaten and his family basking in the glow and divine favor of their patron god, Aten. The lower image is one of the most remarkable artifacts from ancient Egypt we possess. It's a three-dimensional representation of Akhenaten's queen, Nefertiti. Produced sometime in the mid-14th century, this brightly colored piece stands 20 inches high, and its historical significance lies not simply in its aesthetic beauty, but also in the fact that an image of a female aristocrat was created and preserved for so many centuries. The images I've just showed you raise another important issue in the study of ancient Egypt, namely visual art. As you can see from this slide, visual art in ancient Egypt wasn't primarily decorative. Given that, what was its purpose? That is, what function did it serve in society? The image on the left of the slide also raises another important question for us. Namely, was there a representative hierarchy in ancient Egyptian visual art? Put differently, why are some human figures drawn larger than others? Now, I'm sure that many of you have seen Egyptian art before, but what you might not know is that ancient Egyptian art was created according to a canon, or a system of measurement, in which the human form was depicted according to a standardized system called a module. As one scholar notes, quote, "This method of representation is conceptual, that is, based on ideas, rather than perceptual, that is, based on visual evidence. The conceptual approach represents a highly stylized record of reality. Because this artistic system is conceptual rather than perceptual, none of the human figures that we find in ancient Egyptian art appear lifelike." One of the great artistic discoveries in human history is single-point perspective. As you can see from this slide, perspective is the science of rendering three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional plane. Until around the 5th century BCE, perspective didn't exist in representational art, which is why all of the art you see from ancient Egypt appears to be flat. One of the reasons we're talking about ancient Egyptian art is that it's what we call an iconic system of religious art. That is, it employs representational images of gods. The literature found in the Old Testament seems to favor an aniconic approach to art. That is, we have texts that prohibit the making of images to represent God. These prohibitions might be in response to the proliferation of images and representational religious art in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, which the Old Testament views by and large as idolatry, or worshiping an image of a deity. One of the greatest cultural legacies left to us by ancient Egypt is its architecture. Most of the temples that still exist from ancient Egypt date from the period of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1075 BCE. Scholars of religion and scholars of ancient Egypt note that these temples are examples of what we call cosmogenic architecture. That is, buildings that are modeled on how the cultures that produced them imagined the cosmos. In the image on the right of this slide, you can see columns from the great temple of Amun-Ra in Karnak that were produced around 1220 BCE. If you look carefully in the bottom of the image, you can see human tourists, which gives you an idea of the immense scale and size of this temple. The Old Testament mentions two temples that were both constructed in Jerusalem, but nothing of the first temple remains. Only one wall that was built as an add-on to the second temple is still standing in Jerusalem today. Now that we've talked about ancient Egypt a little, let's shift our focus to talk about Mesopotamia. Again, Gloria Fierro writes, quote, Mesopotamia's unpredictable rivers, vulnerable geographic situation, and erratic climate contributed to the mood of fear and insecurity that is reflected in all forms of Mesopotamian expression. Take a minute and ask yourself, how does this situation compare to that in ancient Egypt? That is, take a look at the map I provide of Mesopotamia on this slide and the next, and ask yourself the same questions that I posed earlier in this video. Namely, what kind of neighbors do we see surrounding Mesopotamia? Were these neighbors allies, or were they potential invaders? Fierro mentions the unpredictability of Mesopotamia's rivers as well as its erratic climate. How might these geographical and topographical characteristics have affected the way in which Mesopotamians understood the universe and their place in it? As a way to understand these questions better, let's talk for a minute about one of the most important literary products from ancient Mesopotamia, namely a document called the Anu Malik. This is one of the great epic poems of our world, and in the Babylonian version, it runs to around 1,100 lines. This is an epic poem that focuses on the creation of the world and the universe, but only in an incidental fashion, as its main focus is on the ascendancy and supremacy of a character named Marduk. Like many ancient Near Eastern creation epics, this is a story that was recited or perhaps even reenacted in a ritual festival on the fourth day of the Babylonian New Year celebration, and was most likely used as a sort of propaganda in that the king had his divine right to rule renewed during the celebration. Thus, the recitation of the story served to underscore the orderliness of the cosmos, mirrored in microcosm by the orderliness of the king's rule. We can date the Babylonian version of this epic fairly well because it's cited in the famous law code of Hammurabi, about which we'll talk in a second. First, though, let's talk in more detail about the content of the Anu Malik. I'll summarize the story recounted in the epic in depth, so you'll be able to see some of the parallels between this creation epic and the stories of creation in Genesis 1 to 3. The story of the Anu Malik is one of divine generational conflict. The outcome of this conflict is divine combat, leaving one of the younger gods, Marduk, as the supreme deity. The story begins with a divine couple named Apsu and Tiamat. They produce divine offspring, and several generations pass. The younger generations of deities begin to bother the older, and Apsu, over the protests of Tiamat, decides to kill all of them. However, the younger gods find out about his plan, and a god named Ea kills Apsu. Following this, Ea and his wife produce Marduk. Since the main purpose of the story is to praise Marduk, it takes pains to describe his stature. He is a, quote, double god, so that he would surpass all the other gods in form and in strength, end quote. Following the creation of Marduk, the older gods again complain to Tiamat about the younger ones, and this time she listens. She creates 11 horrible monsters and installs a fellow named Kingu as the leader of the divine rebellion. Meanwhile, the younger gods have appointed Marduk as their champion. When they discover that Marduk has the power to, quote, destroy and to recreate, end quote, they proclaim him king of the gods. Finally, the combat begins. When Kingu sees Marduk, he turns tail and runs away. Eventually, Tiamat and Marduk decide to fight one another. Marduk sends a wind at Tiamat, and when she opens her mouth to swallow it, he manages to keep her mouth opened with more wind. This wind distends her belly and constipates her. He then, quote, shot an arrow which pierced her belly, split her down the middle, and slit her heart, vanquished her, and extinguished her life. He threw down her corpse and stood on top of her, end quote. Following his victory, Marduk, quote, trampled the lower part of Tiamat. With his unsparing mace, he smashed her skull. He severed the arteries of her blood, and he made the north wind carry this blood off to his compatriots as good news, end quote. Next, Marduk begins to dismember Tiamat and create the world. In an extended quote from the epic, we're told that he, quote, divided the monstrous shape and created marvels from it. He sliced her in half like a fish set out to dry. Half of her he put up to roof the sky. He drew a bolt across it and made a guard hold it. Her waters he arranged so that they could not escape. He fashioned stands for the great gods. As for the stars, he set up constellations corresponding to them. He designated the year and marked out its divisions. With her liver, he located the zenith. He opened the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers from her eyes. He piled up clear-cut mountains from her udder. He set her thigh to make fast the sky. With half of her, he made a roof. And finally, he fixed the earth, end quote. Following this, Marduk creates a quote-unquote luxurious dwelling where the center of his religion shall be, and he names it Babylon. The gods then rejoice over Marduk's accomplishments, and inspired by their praise, he decides to, quote, perform miracles, end quote. That is, to make humans. He says, quote, let me put blood together and make bones too. Let me set up primeval man. Man shall be his name. Let me create a primeval man. The work of the gods shall be imposed on him, and so the gods shall be at leisure. Ea suggests that they make humans from the blood of the leader of the rebellion, our old friend Kingu. So the gods bind Kingu, and humans are created from his blood. The narrative doesn't specifically describe the creation of humans because, as it says, quote, that deed is impossible to describe, end quote. The epic then concludes with the younger gods holding a feast and praising Marduk by 50 different names. Now, the main message of the epic has to do, as we've seen, with the ascendancy and supremacy of Marduk. The story details the how and the why of Marduk's status among the gods. The creation of the world and of humans is an interesting sidebar to this main emphasis. Of particular importance is the way in which Marduk establishes the sky and earth. He does so by destroying and dismembering his ancestor and the creator of all the gods, Tiamat. Thus he creates everything we know out of pre-existing material. The same is true with regard to humans. They're created from the blood of the rebellious Kingu, which might be an important etiological or explanatory connection. That is, the character of humanity is tied to its origin. Humans are created in the epic specifically to do the work of the gods so that the gods can have more leisure time. In effect, humans are created to be servants of and for the gods. There are many parallels between the Enuma Elish and the accounts in Genesis chapters 1 to 3, as you might have imagined. The following chart contains some of the more obvious parallels. Pause the video and take a closer look at this chart before going any further. In addition, the order of creation in Genesis 1 and in the Enuma Elish is similar. Compare the following table. Again, pause the video and take a close look at this chart before going any further. Now, even though these similarities exist, not many scholars feel there's a direct literary dependence of Genesis on the Enuma Elish. Rather, since the material in Genesis 1 was most likely composed at the end of the Babylonian exile, it's more likely that the author was responding to the general Babylonian ideas current during the 6th century BCE. Of course, the differences and similarities in content don't detract from the commonalities of function. That is, all these stories of creation serve similar functions. Namely, they're attempting to answer the essential questions of humanity. Why are we here? What is our purpose? How are we to behave towards others? Why are things the way they are? These stories prescribe moral and ethical behavior even as they describe the founding of the heavens and earth. In the field of religious studies, scholars assign pride of place to myths because myth serves both a prescriptive and a descriptive function. That is, it prescribes what sorts of behavior and belief are acceptable and which forms are unacceptable. At the same time, it describes a particular set of occurrences, namely, a story. So myth is etiological, that is, explanatory. At the same time, it designates parameters of orthodoxy, correct belief, and orthopraxis, correct practice. Returning to the realm of history, some of the most important historical achievements that we know of from ancient Mesopotamian society take place in the mid-24th century. During this time, an Akkadian named Sargon I managed to consolidate the various city-states in existence in the area called Sumer and created the world's first empire. This new empire only lasted a few centuries before collapsing and giving way to the new city-state of Babylon. One of the most important achievements of this first Babylonian empire for our purposes is the activity of the sixth ruler of this empire, named Hammurabi. Because he wanted to achieve a greater cultural and political unity among his kingdom and his subjects, Hammurabi collected all known written laws and codified them. The thinking here should be obvious. If there's one law throughout the empire, then organization and enforcement will be much easier, and cultural uniformity would hopefully be on the horizon. Take a minute and ask yourself, is this a human or a divine law? In answering this question, be sure to take a look at the image of the remarkable Stella of Hammurabi from around the mid-18th century that I provide for you in this slide. Who are these two figures? What's implied about their relationship and about the law that's contained on the stela from the image on the headpiece? This will be an important issue for us, as we'll encounter examples of ancient law in our engagement with Old Testament literature. Unlike the situation in ancient Egypt, we have very few examples of architecture from Sumer and Babylonia that have survived history. From the work of archaeologists and historians, it seems that the central architectural model from these periods is the Ziggurat, a terraced, tower-like building that served as both shrine and temple. That is, both civic and religious functions had a home in this building. Take a minute and ask yourself, how does the Ziggurat differ in form and function from the pyramids of ancient Egypt? I hope that this presentation has been helpful in introducing you to some basic issues and key examples of cultural products from ancient Near Eastern cultures that either influenced or exemplify the socio-historical context of Old Testament literature. Remember, it's always important to have as much knowledge as possible of the contexts out of which religious movements, literature, and ideas arise in order to understand them accurately.